devotees asked me if I had any difficulty in understanding his accent and the way his pronunciation was going. And I said no. In fact, I made a comment that I could detect a slight Scottish accent in some of the words that he was using. And I didn't know that he was, when he was a young boy, he went to Scottish Churches College in Calcutta. Although later on, when I was able to get his association while massaging him, and Srila Prabhupada was getting to know me, he was asking questions where I was coming from. That's the first thing he asked me, was where I was coming from, and I said, Scotland. And then he started to reminisce that when he was being educated, he was educated by, all his teachers were Scottish, and that he had to study the Bible, he learnt the Catechism, and he asked me if I knew any Scottish lords. And I said, no, I don't personally know any Scottish lords. And he said, oh, I met one, Lord Zetland. He came to our college in Calcutta. And then he asked me if I studied British history. And I said, oh yes, I was. My whole education was in Scotland. So then he asked me a few questions. He asked me, when was the Battle of Trafalgar? And I said 1805. And then he asked me, when was the Battle of Waterloo? And I said 1815. And he said, oh, you know British history just like I know British history. So he was kind of testing me. And also he was asking things like, how far was Glasgow from London? And I told him approximately 400 miles. How long did it take to go there by train? I said approximately 8 hours. So when he was relating like that with me, it put me very much at my ease, because I really didn't know how to start up any conversation with Srila Prabhupada when I was in the process of massaging him, and that's the way he won my heart over too, because he was relating to me in a way that I could appreciate, and I could talk with him. It wasn't a philosophical discussion, the first meeting. Although, when I got the opportunity to ask him a question, which was after leaving the airport and arriving at John Lennon's estate, Prabhupada gave a kirtan and a very philosophical class. But my uppermost desire at that time was to ask when I could get initiation, because that's all I was thinking about. So at the end of class, and Prabhupada asked for questions, I stuck up my hand and he said yes, and I said, when can I take initiation? Nothing to do with the class. I mean, it was nothing to do with the class, but Srila Prabhupada said, that is another thing, that we will see. But it was about a week later that Prabhupada actually got round to performing initiation. He said, so you know what the 4 principles are? And I explained yes. And you're chanting minimum 16 rounds, and I said yes. So on that premise, he accepted me. And then when he gave me my name, he said, your name from now on is Dhananjaya Das. He said, this is the name for Arjuna. He said, Dhananjaya means conqueror of wealth. He said, you will have no difficulty in acquiring wealth. He said, actually, there's so much wealth, and he put his hands up in there and said, there's so much wealth everywhere. He said, money is flying in all directions. He said, we simply have to learn the art of catching it. That's what he told me. Well, see, Shyam Sundar was very eager to have this very place transformed into a proper temple. And so the building became like a construction site. And he mentioned to George it was very difficult for us to live there because there was so much dust, and there was so much noise, because he had to put in reinforced metal beams and all kinds of work had to be done there. And he said it was very difficult for the devotees to live in that building while that construction work was going on. And could he help us in any way? And he said, well, I'll speak to John Lennon, because he's just acquired a big property he might be able to put you up. Because at that time, George was living in Esher, in Surrey. And he didn't have a big house, but he knew that John's house was much bigger. He hadn't moved into Friar Park in Henley. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have invited us to stay with him. But it was just due to the circumstances. So John agreed. He thought it was a really good idea. In fact, he was incredibly favorable. He offered us 5 acres of land. So this particular estate had 76 acres, and he wasn't into farming or agriculture or anything like that. And he said that we could have 5 acres of land. When Prabhupada was told this, Srila Prabhupada said that we should utilize this land for growing all our fresh vegetables and fruits. And he said that anything that was left over that we couldn't use for ourselves, for our own consumption, we should take into the local market in London. And he said we should take it in by bullock cart. And when Prabhupada said this, I said, but Prabhupada, there's so many lorries going in, because at that time, of course, Covent Garden was very close to where Bury Place was in Bloomsbury. Covent Garden was just down, it's still, of course, there, near where the Opera House is in Bow Street Magistrates Court. And so I said, but the lorries will get there before the bullock cart. And because we were 25 miles, at least 25, if not more, miles outside of, London. And Prabhupada said, no. He said, the bullock cart should leave the night before. And they will walk all night, and they will reach the garden before the market garden before the lorries arrive. So in 1969, this was Prabhupada's vision. He wanted us to train up animals, hitch them to a cart, and take fresh market produce into central London. He also said that we should hold a big Rath Yatra festival, starting from John Lennon's estate, and go in procession all the way into central London, stopping at different little towns and villages on the way. In the beginning, John was much more interested than Yoko. In fact, one evening, John and Yoko invited Prabhupada over to listen to a song that he had just recorded. This was just after his 29th birthday. And he made a song called Cold Turkey. And of course, the significance of that song was that he was actually having withdrawal symptoms coming off heroin because, and I saw this myself, he was, himself and his wife were shooting up heroin constantly while we were there. And that's why Yoko Ono had so many miscarriages, because she was also really anxious to have a child by John Lennon. And I had to clean up an office one time in the main house, and when I moved a filing cabinet, I came across all these, hypodermic needles. And syringes were just lying around. Also, they had some very unsavory characters living at their place. They had someone called Alexander Trocky, and he was a Scotsman, but he had moved to New York and he'd written a book about his visions on heroin. And also William Burroughs was invited, and William Burroughs wrote a book called The Soft Machine. He was living in North Africa. So they were really dabbling a lot in that drug culture, looking for identity or something. They were looking for something. And that's why we were there too. And of course, they had made a record called John and Yoko Forever, because Yoko's whole consciousness was fixed that she wanted some or another to live with John forever, for eternity. And of course, when Yoko asked this question of Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, "This is impossible," said, "At death, immediately you are separated." then she lost all interest. It was like a private invitation. There was Srila Prabhupada and his secretary, his servant Purushottam. But Trivikram and myself knew about this meeting. And we also knew the layout of the house because we'd also been stripping paint from the walls, the wooden boards, because it was all beautiful oak paneling in the main living room. And there was French windows leading out into the garden. So what we did was, without Prabhupada's knowing, without John Lennon's knowing, we had, in the dark, gone over to the French windows, and although the curtains were drawn, they weren't completely closed. There was like a little slit, and we could see into the room. And also, by the French windows, John Lennon had put up all his recording equipment. There was an Ampex machine, because he wanted Prabhupada to hear the master tape, the master recording of this song. And Prabhupada had also been recording. He had been recording some bhajans, and these were accompanied by harmonium and tampura. So we saw the scene through the slit in the curtains, that Prabhupada came into that room, and he was invited to sit down in a very large, comfortable sofa along with Purushottam, which was at the other end of the room. And Yoko was sitting on a chair next to Prabhupada, and then John said, "So I've made this recording, I'd like you to hear it." And he came over to where the equipment was, and he started playing around with the knobs and dials. And it started to move, but then all of a sudden, he couldn't get it to work. There was no sound coming out. The tape was moving, but there was no sound coming out. And we could, because we were facing him, and he was facing us, although he couldn't see us, because we were in pitch dark, and he was in this, in this bright room. We could see he was really getting frustrated, because there was no sound coming out of his equipment. And after a minute or so, Prabhupada realized he was having difficulty, and he said, "So it seems you're having trouble, but I have also done some recording, and I have brought my tape recording machine, and that's working. It's a little Ur portable." And he told Purushottam to start it up, and so instead of Prabhupada having to hear this horrific song, I don't know if you've heard this song, it's a horrific song. He was spared that song, and he was able to play his music to John Lennon. So John had to retire from his equipment and sit down near Yoko Ono and listen. And then shortly after that, after a few minutes conversation, Prabhupada said, "So now I have to go back. I have some translation work to do." And then he had left the room. And then as he was coming round, we jumped out of the bushes and paid our obeisances to Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada rubbed us on our backs as we were paying our obeisances. And he went, "Jai," he said, "So, you saw?" George asked if he should join and move into the temple and shave up. And Prabhupada said, "No." He said, "What you're doing through your music is much more important." He said, "You're already a devotee of Krishna, so you continue." And he was talking about some music he had written for a singer called Lakshmi Shankar, Ravi Shankar's sister. And there was one song entitled "Krishna, Where Are You?" And Prabhupada listened to that recording in George's presence, and he said, "This is our Gaudiya Vaishnav mood." He said, "This is very correct, that we should be crying out, 'Krishna, where are you?' We shouldn't think that we have captured Krishna, that we know who is Krishna." And he said, this is how you can serve our society the best. Another time when we went to George Harrison's house, This is after a program at Reading. Reading is a city nearby, Henley. And that's where that famous photograph was taken in the grounds of George Harrison's property. We went inside the house because when we came there, we couldn't find, or Shamsundar couldn't find where George was. But Shamsundar knew the layout of the house and knew which room we should go to. So we all went there. We went to that room and waited for George. And as we were waiting, it was getting dark. And then finally, George arrived, and he came with a big bouquet of flowers and a big basket of fruit. Because he'd never come empty-handed, he'd always want to bring something for Srila Prabhupada. So he'd actually been out, doing this, getting some gifts for Srila Prabhupada. And he presented these to Srila Prabhupada, and he paid full dandavats to Srila Prabhupada. And then Srila Prabhupada he said, the purpose of this human form of life is to leave this world of dark and go back to the world of light. And as he was saying this, the room was getting, because there was no light on, it was getting darker and darker and darker, and Prabhupada was emphasizing this point. Prabhupada would always be expert at using nature, any situation that he would find himself in. And he's saying, this is the world of dark. He said, this world requires illumination. And the only illumination we have is from the sun and the moon. He said, without the sunshine, there would be no life, there would be no light. And of course, when the sun sets, then we need to call upon artificial illumination, electricity, fire. He said, but in the world of light, there's no need for any kind of artificiality. He said, this is where we all wish to live, in the world of light, not in the world of dark. So he just was constantly emphasizing this particular point. And George was very much appreciating. Another time we were walking and there was a patch of yellow grass, and Prabhupada, in his famous way, stopped and he pointed to this patch of yellow grass and he said, so why is this grass yellow and all the rest of the other grass is green around? All the grass around is green. Why is this grass yellow? And Gurudas tried to give some philosophical explanation. There must be some reason because the nature of the soil, or because of too much rain, or Actually, no, it wasn't philosophical. It was like a practical explanation why the grass is yellow. And Prabhupada said, no. He said, this grass is yellow because it is detached from the root. He said, all plants get their nourishment from the root. And as soon as there's some detachment from the root, immediately there's difficulty. He said, just like we are all in difficulty in this material world because we become detached from Krishna. As soon as we're attached to Krishna, we'll become very successful in our lives. I asked a question about Lord Shiva. I wanted to know Lord Shiva's position. And for some reason, Prabhupada answered so strongly, almost in anger, that I would bring up Lord Shiva's name. And I was told later on the reason that he had replied so strongly was because this was quite a regular question that came up amongst hippies because of the drug culture, because of what Prabhupada had seen in New York and San Francisco, and how many young people were smoking chillums and saying this is Shiv Prasad or whatever, this is. And so Prabhupada very strongly said, he is not God. He is like chief of police. He is designated authority. He said he is not the supreme authority. Krishna is like this. So he was he was really giving me the sauce when I brought up the question about Lord Shiva. That's also stuck in my mind since then. Another time we were walking close to a field where there were some donkeys and some horses. And Kulashikar started shouting out, Hare Krishna, really loudly to try and draw the attention of the animals in the field. And Prabhupada said, they don't have the ears to hear. So they cannot appreciate, even you chant at the top of your voice, they cannot appreciate, they don't have the proper ears to hear. And Kulashikar said, but Lord Chaitanya, he went through the Dandakaranya forest and he was chanting to all the animals, he said. And then Prabhupada smiled and said, well, maybe if you chant loud enough, they may hear something. There was one incident, again this is to do with the town of Reading. There was a Mr. Prajapati. And this was actually the same, as far as I can recall, the same evening after we left John Lennon's estate. George Harrison's Friar Park in Henley. We went to this Mr. Prajapati's house. And the idea was that Prabhupada would take some milk and maybe some halava and a little bit of puri, and then we'd go back to Berry Place. But when we got there, and all the other devotees were already there, because there was only a few of us actually went to George Harrison's house that evening. Mr. Prajapati and his wife were very expert in serving prasadam. So he asked Srila Prabhupada what he would like, and Prabhupada said, I'll take little milk. And then Mr. Prajapati said, would you like something with the milk? He said, so Prabhupada said, you have prepared something? He said, yes. We have a little, if you like some sabji and some puri and some halava. So Prabhupada said, all right, because Prabhupada actually liked to take especially halava and puris with his milk here in the UK. But as Prabhupada was being served, they were bringing in other preparations as well. And so Prabhupada was saying, oh, what is this? This looks nice. And he would take a little bit of this, and then something else would come, and then something else would come. And all of a sudden there was about 15 or 20 different preparations in front of Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, oh, you have tricked me. And Mr. Prajapati said, yes. He said, what could we do? We felt so honored you were coming to our house. We cooked a huge feast. And Prabhupada said, but what about for everyone here? And Mr. Prajapati said, yes, no, we've cooked sufficient quantity to feed everybody. And he said, so Srila Prabhupada said, all right, so everybody should eat too. So we all sat down, and this is like 11 o'clock at night, 11:30 at night. And we all took this massive feast. And next morning, Srila Prabhupada wanted to go into, he didn't stay. He didn't leave to go to Berry Place. He stayed in Mr. Prajapati's house. And we stayed in somebody else's house. And next morning we had to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning because Prabhupada wanted to go back to have darshan of Radhalandanishwaram. And I remember it was very difficult for all of us to get up after staying up so late and eating so much. Anyway, this day, it was a very different circumstance, and I tried as best I could to concentrate on my service, which was to start off with massaging Prabhupada's head. And as I was massaging Prabhupada's head, Purushottam was coming in and out. Generally speaking, it would only be Prabhupada and the devotee who would be massaging him, but Purushottam was there too. And Prabhupada would ask, what is this? What is happening to Purushottam? Because he was in charge of the television. And he was giving some commentary, some running commentary of what was going on. And when the shot actually came of them landing on the moon and coming out, so Prabhupada asked to Purushottam, so what are you seeing? And Purushottam said, well, they have landed on the moon and it looks like they're in a very arid area. It looks like desert. And there's little pebbles and it's very dusty. And Prabhupada said, oh, there are no buildings, there are no people, there are no gardens. And Purushottam said, no, Prabhupada, this is the moon. And he was a little disturbed that Prabhupada was asking these questions, as if Prabhupada didn't know what the moon looked like. And so Prabhupada concluded, said, then this is not the moon. He said, according to Vedic astronomy, the moon is an upper heavenly planet full of a very advanced civilization, full of buildings and parks and lakes, a very beautiful place, full of all varieties of life. So this is not the moon. This is my conclusion from what you're saying to me. And Purushottam got into a really heated discussion and took the side of the scientists. And it was during this moment that Prabhupada went like this, and he wanted me to come and sit in front of him. And I thought, because Prabhupada suspected that I was watching television, but then his hands came on my head, and I was sitting higher up than Prabhupada, so his hands were up like this, and they were massaging my head. And he said, like this, you do like this. And so he did this twice. And then the third time when I went back, I was massaging, and Prabhupada said, still you're not getting it right. And I said, but Srila Prabhupada, I promise you, I'm not looking at the television. I'm not. I'm just concentrating on... And then Prabhupada chuckled and said, that's all right. But also, at that same moment, because we were close to the door, to the hall, and the door was just slightly open. There was just like a little chink. And Prabhupada looked through the crack in the door, and he saw that Malati had just taken some milk bottles from the little hatch by the main front door to the flat, and she had put these dirty milk bottles on the same little table that the offering that she had gone to great pain and trouble to prepare for Prabhupada's deities. And she had put these dirty bottles on there. And of course, this is putting something very suchi with something very muchi. And Prabhupada saw this just out of the corner of his eye. It wasn't like he was looking through the door all the time. He was looking at the television, he was talking to Purushottam, he was concerned about my consciousness, that I was getting absorbed in the discussion, and I wasn't really there for the discussion, I was there to massage Prabhupada. And at the same time, Malati had messed up an offering. And so then he called Malati in a very angry mood. And again, generally speaking, when Prabhupada's taking a massage, he doesn't call on any ladies to come to see him. But there was tremendous urgency there, and anger. And Malati flew in through the door, paid her obeisances, and she was clutching the top of her sari, keeping it over her head. And, what's happened, Srila Prabhupada? He says, can't you see? Can't you learn? I have taught you so many things. Can't you learn? When are you going to like this? And she didn't know what she had done. She did not know what Prabhupada was talking about. So she was getting more and more confused. And she was getting really disturbed. And then Prabhupada had to point out what she had done. And then she started to cry, and then she ran out and she took the bottles away. When this Anglican nun came to meet Srila Prabhupada, and she was wearing what we generally recognize as a nun's habit. Although she wasn't a Catholic nun, she was an Anglican nun. And she kept her rosary just like a Catholic nun. And Prabhupada asked her what she chanted on, what was the prayer that she chanted. And she said, well, my prayer is, my dear Lord Jesus Christ, please have mercy on me. And she says, I say this with all sincerity on every beat before I do my work. And Prabhupada said, yes, he said, this is a very good prayer. He said, this prayer, my dear Lord Jesus Christ, please have mercy upon me. You should go on, continue praying like this, and certainly Lord Jesus Christ will bestow his mercy upon you. Another time when I was present with Prabhupada and he was speaking with a cardinal in Rome, Cardinal Pignedoli. This cardinal happened to be also the Bishop of Bombay, and he had met the devotees in Bombay. So he kept saying to Prabhupada, he said, what you're doing and what we are doing is just the same. Just the same thing. And then Prabhupada said, yes, but we have our book Bhagavad-Gita, and he presented Prabhupada a copy. Prabhupada presented a copy to Cardinal Punyedali. You should read this because this will give you more understanding on how to surrender oneself to God. Srila Prabhupada made a comment to me when I was in Rome that Italians are religious by nature and they want the blessings of God. You see how many flock to St. Peter's Square whenever the Pope is there, and giving his talk. He said they want the blessings of God, but they don't know how to get those blessings. He said we should teach them how to become qualified for the blessings of God. So he said this is the most important ingredient that's missing within the Catholic teachings, is how to become qualified. Through Jayapataka Maharaj, we'd all been invited to Srila Maharaj's mutt over in Navadip. And so we all went. We thought this was part of the program, that we were going to meet some of Prabhupada's godbrothers. And so they had arranged a whole big program over in Srila Maharaj's mutt, along with Prasadam. And there was talks by Srila Maharaj, there was talks by different of my sannyasi godbrothers. And we were over there for a few hours, and then we all came back, and Prabhupada was actually waiting at the gate. And he called for Jayapataka Maharaj, and he said, so where have you all been? And Jayapataka Maharaj said, we went over to Srila Maharaj's mutt for a program. He said, you didn't tell me? Because no one informed Prabhupada about this program. Prabhupada got really upset. So he called Jayapataka Maharaj up to his room and he told him, he said, this is not right. He said, all these local Bengalis in Navadip are thinking that all you foreigners have come due to the preaching effort of Srila Maharaj. He said, he never preached in the West, I preached in the West. You have all come because of me. But he is getting all the publicity. He said, you have to be very careful how you deal with my godbrothers. So they will take full advantage. They will take all the credit, but actually they don't deserve that credit. So at 74, he gave this warning that we shouldn't give the credit to his godbrothers for our presence in India. And when Prabhupada was in Rome, he commented by looking at the architecture that the Vedic civilization has spread up to Rome. Just by looking at the old Roman wall and some other Roman ruins, he said that style of architecture is to be found within the Vedic civilization. And that's also where Srila Prabhupada wanted a book to be written entitled How Krishna Consciousness Can Solve All the Problems of the World. And every morning he would ask us to bring all kinds of problems to him and he would solve them through Krishna consciousness. And in 74 there was a problem with, there was a big oil embargo going on. So there was a major petroleum crisis. And oil had gone from $4 a barrel up to $40 or something, some huge leap. And Prabhupada said, this can be solved very easily. He said, everyone should stop using motor cars and go by foot or by horse or by cart. He said, this motor car society won't last very long. He said that in human society, the mode of travel, the most normal mode of travel is by horse or by cart, by camel, and by elephant. He said that mode of transport has been around since time immemorial. He said only in Kali Yuga do we have this motor car, and he said this motor car society will not last very long. He said when the petrol dries up, when the oil dries up, What use are your motor cars? He said, I never intended the temples to be for householders. He said that temples are meant for brahmacharis and sannyasis. Householders are meant to live outside. He said, so I'm giving you a house to live. And he said, and while you're over there, you should also work. He said, householders should live outside and they should work outside also. So this is how the Mukut business started up, under Prabhupada's personal care and attention. He even took me to Aligarh because there's so much brass making goes on, especially of the unfinished, unrefined casting of the deities. And Prabhupada wanted me to start up a business manufacturing not only crowns and dresses for the deities as a means of livelihood for maintaining myself over in that house. He gave me a house to myself, that Taparia house, which of course is now the Goshala. I developed that whole thing through the income from the business over the years. But he also wanted me to distribute Gaurnitai deities on a massive scale. He said this is the way we can actually spread the cultural aspect of Krishna consciousness, is through worship of Gaurnitai. He said that these Gaurnitai deities should be sold along with the books as Sankirtan paraphernalia and be sold as Hare Krishna dolls. He said, in the world, people are keeping so many different kinds of dolls. They're keeping Russian dolls, they're keeping Spanish dolls, Mexican dolls, French dolls, Dutch dolls. He said they can also keep Hare Krishna dolls. And he said, Gaurnitai are so merciful, they can enter into the home of a meat eater and not take offense. So he said, we are distributing book Bhagavat and we can also distribute person Bhagavat. He said if every temple takes minimum 10 pairs of these Hare Krishna dolls a month, we have 120 temples. He said that's 1,200 pairs of Gaurnitai every month. He said that is good business. You should learn how to do this. You should push it like anything, which I tried to do, but no one was interested. And he said, when they're sold on the street, this is directly from Srila Prabhupada, he said that when the devotee sells the book and then he says, by the way, we've got these Hare Krishna dolls. Why don't you take them home as well? And so the person in the street will say, well, what are they? He said, well, these are special dolls. If you look after them nicely, they will fulfill all of your desires. So the person may take them, whatever the price is, and go back and put them in his display cabinet or on his shelf or whatever. And he himself may not be particularly interested to know how to fulfill his desires. But he'll be questioned by his family members. Well, we recognize these dolls, but what are these little brass guys there? Who are they? Oh, these are Hare Krishna dolls, and I was told if I look after them nicely, they'll fulfill all my desires. And Prabhupada said, so then at least one member of the family eventually will want to know, how can I fulfill all my desires? How do I do this? What do I do? And that the only place he can go is back to the devotees. And the devotees will then teach them how to offer with love and devotion a little fruit, a flower, some water. And later on, as they get more devotional, they can also be introduced to Arctic paraphernalia, and then changing the dresses and so on. So this was another big vision of Srila Prabhupada.